Okay, so just as in the last interview, I'm really inspired with everything that you share with us, and specifically the command, the grip that you have on your subject, that is the global change. I was so much inspired by that, and I really appreciate it. Now, this time we are going to talk about the future of our education system.
Yeah.
And just as you have mentioned already, that every single thing, every single field of life is going to get affected by this global change, even if we talk about the animals, even if we talk about human beings themselves, if it's the ocean, whatsoever it is, the forest, everything is going to suffer because of this global change. How do you see what would be the future of education because of this global change? We are not specifically talking about the atmosphere right now. We are talking about the impact that we have created on the education. So, how do you see that?
Well, I think that when we think about education, and I think, from children who are 5 years old up through
Hmm.
people in universities,
Hmm.
we have to make an understanding of the physical and biological world around us
Hmm.
part of the education, just as, for hundreds of years, people have stressed mathematics
Hmm.
and writing or rhetoric.
Hmm.
Now I think we have to add to that the science of our planet, because
Hmm.
that is what's going to determine all of our livelihoods,
True.
by the end of this century, well before the end of this century.
Hmm. That's true. That's true. So, how do you see it in the future? Let's suppose if we talk about after 5 years.
Well, let's step back for a second and just consider where we are at this moment of time and how we know where we are.
Hmm.
I think it's fair to say that if you could go back in time and talk to your great grandparents,
Hmm.
you would find that the world they inhabited, in terms of the physical world now, I'm not
Hmm.
talking about
Hmm. Hmm.
technology, but the physical world was very much like the world that their great grandparents knew. And that was
Hmm.
very much like the world that their great grandparents knew back for thousands of years.
Hmm.
Their system has been fairly stable.
Hmm.
Now, having said that, the world that you inhabit is not the same as the
Hmm.
world your great grandparents inhabited, and it is not the same as your great grandchildren will
Hmm.
inhabit. So the world is changing at geologically unusual rates, and we
Hmm.
know that for a number of reasons. One is there's more than a century of temperature measurements all over the world, and the world is getting warmer. People who live where there are glaciers are seeing the glaciers recede, and that's happening
Hmm.
all over the world.
Hmm.
Um, and that correlates
Hmm.
with an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There's
Hmm.
about a third more CO2 in the atmosphere today than there was when I was born.
Hmm.
And that's important because carbon dioxide is what's sometimes called a greenhouse gas, which
Hmm.
is that it will absorb heat radiation, and some of it will go back in toward the
Hmm.
Earth rather than going out to space.
Hmm.
And so we know it's getting warmer. We know that's because of increased CO2. And by looking at the detailed chemistry of the carbon in carbon dioxide, we know that the principal source of this carbon dioxide is the burning of fossil fuels. So
Hmm.
we know it's getting warmer, and we know we're responsible. And the
Hmm.
question is, what will this look like down the road?
Hmm. Good. Okay. So yeah, it has changed now. But let me ask the same question once again. This is, if we compare ourselves with the forefathers, so with the grandparents, so of course that's different. How about if I see my grandchild, what sort of planet they are going to experience later on? If the things are going on the way it is, or might be we are not taking care of the things that we should be taking care of, so how exactly it's going to be, and how do you see the future?
Well, I think we know a lot about the direction we're going in, again, because
Hmm.
we can measure it.
Hmm.
There is no question that even if we stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow, the
Hmm.
Earth would continue to get warmer for 1,000 years.
Hmm.
And so, if you're talking to your grandson, in the
Hmm.
future,
Hmm.
his world will be warmer than
Hmm.
yours.
Hmm.
We also know, and this is particularly relevant to a country like Pakistan,
Hmm.
that many of the areas that are arid or semi arid now will
Hmm.
become more arid as time goes by.
Hmm.
So we know in the southwestern United States and northwestern Mexico, uh, basically 40 million people live on a water supply that is not sustainable.
Hmm.
And what I've read, at least, about Pakistan suggests that for two reasons, water will become an increasing issue in
Hmm.
Pakistan as well. One, because of increasing aridity, and
Hmm.
also many people ultimately rely on the melting of glacial water
Hmm.
from the Himalaya. And what will happen is that those glaciers are themselves disappearing. So
Hmm.
on some time scale, and this is a time scale of decades to centuries,
Hmm.
that source of water
Hmm.
is going to become more scarce. And so I think in the first instance,
Hmm.
every child growing up in your country should at least understand this issue and
Hmm.
start thinking about how one can sustain or improve the lives of people in the
Hmm.
face of this change.
Hmm. So, and Pakistan is becoming warmer and warmer every year. I mean, we experience more. I mean, the summer season becomes more difficult every next year. This is true. That this is what we are experiencing here, and water is actually going to become a problem if we do not take care of this problem right now.
Yeah, and I should say that in many ways this is a problem that is not primarily caused by the people of Pakistan.
Hmm.
I think that those countries that are primarily responsible for
Hmm.
global change, and I would include the United States, China,
Hmm.
Western Europe, Gulf oil countries in that group, do have a special responsibility
Hmm.
to try and mitigate that change and develop the new technologies.
Hmm.
The bad news, in a way, is that despite the fact that Pakistani citizens had relatively little to do with causing this change, they will
Hmm.
feel it and they will
Hmm.
have to live with it. So,
Hmm.
learning to use water more wisely, learning
Hmm.
to recycle water perhaps better than
Hmm.
we do, uh, straightforward things that we can do as citizens,
Hmm.
individual citizens,
Hmm. Hmm.
will make a difference.
Hmm, true. So just as you were mentioning about those countries who are might be a bit responsible for this thing, just as you were talking about those, and you were saying that we should come up with new technologies. What technologies you're talking about? What do you mean by those new technologies that are going to help this global warming?
Well, there's a number of them. One of the important things that is happening widely around the world now is that so-called renewable energy resources are being developed, whether it's from wind or tides or you name it. And in order to really make use of that, we
Hmm.
need much better batteries than we
Hmm.
have now, because you need places that can store this energy and
Hmm.
use it when it's needed rather than use it the minute
Hmm.
it's generated. And
Hmm.
and that's happening. I was just reading the other day about some new battery technologies that promise to very much change the
Hmm.
way we can store energy, and that
Hmm.
will help us to rely more on renewable energy and non-fossil fuels.
Hmm.
One thing I think we may have mentioned briefly last time we talked is there are technologies that can actually scrub carbon dioxide from the air. So
Hmm.
we know in principle that can happen, but it has to happen on a massive scale.
Hmm.
And so far, all we know is that it can be demonstrated on a local scale. It's very expensive now,
Hmm.
but I at least as an individual am more comfortable with that kind of technology than something we sometimes read about where people want to inject
Hmm.
aerosol particles into the upper atmosphere to reflect sunlight. That's
Hmm.
at best a temporary solution. It doesn't solve the CO2
Hmm.
problem. So
Hmm.
those are two examples of things that we can do. I think on regional scales that can be developed in many different countries. Um, I think the way we heat, cool, or insulate the places we live in
Hmm.
can be done more intelligently. Many of us live in places, the building materials are things that have been used for hundreds of years. And
Hmm.
there are ways, and certainly in a place like where I live,
Hmm.
where a major source of fossil fuel usage is actually heating
Hmm.
uh, places in the winter. And by insulating our homes better, we could quite cut down on that. I think if the problem, as more likely in many
Hmm.
parts of Pakistan, is
Hmm.
keeping your homes cool, again, I think there are passive designs
Hmm.
that can actually help that. So I think there are those things that we can, that will take sort of global technology and can and should be paid for by those countries with the resources to do it.
Hmm.
There are things that many different communities can do, and
Hmm.
there are things that we can do as individuals.
Hmm.
And we probably need to do all of them if we are going to wrap our arms around this problem on a
Hmm.
global scale.
Yeah, true. So just as you were mentioning about these technologies that we need and the battery thing, that instead of creating and using it at the same time, it's better to store it and utilize it in the future time. That's a wonderful step that these countries are taking, talking about the technology. And coming back to the same point that you were mentioning in the beginning, that just as the mathematics is a subject, the science is a subject, English is a subject, so we also make it a subject so that we would be able to give awareness to this generation and also to the next generation. Does that mean that every country would have different content in the subject, or the same content would work for all the countries?
I'm guessing that it will be a mixture. I
Hmm.
think there are basic parts of the science
Hmm.
that are the same in Canada as they are in Afghanistan.
Hmm.
That's just basic stuff. On the other hand, there are finer grained parts of
Hmm.
this issue that really depend on the culture and technology and livelihoods of individual countries. So that,
Hmm.
what makes sense for Indonesia may
Hmm.
not make sense for Oman and things like
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
this. So I
True.
think, one of the things that I would love to see is that, again, even in elementary education for younger children, I don't think we should burden a 6-year-old with, environmental catastrophe, but we
Hmm.
could start saying, well, how does the world work? You
Hmm.
know, tell us about winds and, the rain, the monsoon,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
and just developing as much a curiosity about this
Hmm.
as the details. And then through time, as children get older, they can, come to have a more sophisticated knowledge of nature.
Hmm.
And then building on that, there comes a time where they do need to learn that humans are having a very strong imprint on
Hmm.
nature.
Hmm.
And one way or another, we all have to think carefully
Hmm.
about how we live our lives.
Hmm. Yeah. And how about, like, even if we introduce this subject here, how about the instructors? I mean, how will we get those instructors by introducing a subject itself? And who is going to introduce? Of course, like, we are going to borrow the books, we are going to borrow the brain from the other countries. But what's your suggestion for the countries like Pakistan?
Well, that's a good question, and let me just mention very briefly
Hmm.
experience in the United States where the people who teach science to
Hmm.
children,
Hmm.
particularly 6 to 12-year-old children, commonly do not have any special training in science
Hmm.
themselves.
Hmm.
And so I think we need to, certainly in my country, we need to train our elementary teachers better
Hmm.
to understand and be able to teach about the earth and its life, at
Hmm.
least in a broad way that's appropriate for children.
Hmm.
And I don't know the teaching qualifications of elementary teachers in Pakistan, but I'm guessing that whatever it is, the country would be well served that when those teachers are being trained, they
Hmm.
get more training in the science of the environment. They don't have
Hmm.
to learn nuclear physics or things like
Yeah, yeah.
this,
Hmm.
but if you live in South Asia, understanding what the monsoon is and how it works would seem to
Hmm.
me to be a pretty basic
Hmm.
part of life. It's probably something that people living in Pakistan 500 years ago
Hmm.
may have had a more intimate understanding of than people who live in Lahore or Islamabad now, and are sort of
Hmm.
shielded from nature. So in
Hmm.
some ways, it's just a matter of, well, not just about, it's a matter of training our teachers well
Hmm.
so that they can educate our children
Hmm.
so that we'll have wise adults in the next generation.
Yeah, that's a wonderful suggestion, and that is the ultimate solution as well, because teacher is the funnel through which every student has to pass, and every the whole nation has to pass through that the education system. So teacher is the biggest responsibility. Teacher has that biggest responsibility, and he can fulfill that. Yeah, that's a good approach. Okay, I mean, if we talk about adding this subject, just as you were mentioning, that a 6-year-old child, he doesn't need to learn about the advanced level of this global warming and the global changes that we are going to experience, might be after 30 years and all. Do you think that the college is a good level where we should train it, or might be the high school or the university? Where exactly shall we add, or should it be the proper degree, or should it be for everybody? It doesn't matter you're doing your degree in medical, in engineering, in business administration. You should be studying that. Would that help, or there should be one specific degree just studied in
Well,
America?
again, I think that both are possible. They're not mutually exclusive. I
Hmm.
do think that certainly in high school, all students should at least learn about how our
Hmm.
planet works and how it's changing. And I think that's whether you're going to go to university or become a carpenter.
Hmm.
I think everyone, particularly
Hmm.
everyone who is going to vote, uh,
Hmm.
should have some basic understanding of the world they live in. Now, I
Hmm.
think for those who do go to university, um, again, I don't really know the university system in Pakistan, but in many parts of North America,
Hmm.
in addition to learning, one subject, well, I'm going to become a biologist, let's
Hmm.
say, students do have to learn other things about the world where, at Harvard, students have to learn some natural science. They have to learn something about world cultures. They need to learn about writing. They need to learn about social interactions. Just because, in addition to having a job, you need to be able to be a responsible and
Hmm.
informed citizen of the world.
Hmm.
And I think that's a good idea. At the same time, some students will be motivated to actually become natural scientists.
Hmm.
And I think there should be a track for those students where they can really start to learn the trade. And in order to be I think anyone who wants to be a biologist, for
Hmm.
better or for worse, really does have to know some math, does
Hmm.
have to know some chemistry, um, does have to know how organisms work.
Hmm.
And if you're interested in the science of the environment, you need to know how the earth works and
Hmm.
how the earth and organisms actually interact.
Hmm. Hmm. True. And how about over there in USA? I mean, is has it become the subject now? I mean, are we taking it in every field, or is it still a bit something we can consider the missing part of the education?
Well, it's at the university level.
Hmm.
It has really accelerated.
Hmm.
Certainly at my university, Harvard, many students who
Hmm.
are interested in either earth science or life science are
Hmm.
really motivated by global change
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
want to be trained so that they can be active participants
Hmm.
in solving the problems. That's
Hmm.
true of engineering students. It's
Hmm.
true of students who actually want to become lawyers now
Hmm.
are commonly as motivated by saving the planet as they are
Hmm.
making money. And so yes, and I think this is broadly true at North American and European universities where you know people who are 18 and 20 years old,
Hmm.
I think, understand the issues much better than their parents do, and
Hmm.
they are motivated to do something about it. So,
Hmm.
yes, I think this teaching people to become the frontline workers of the next generation is really accelerating. And at the same time, I think that nearly all of our students, even if they are majoring in language or economics, you
Hmm.
name it,
Hmm. Hmm.
will actually take a course or two on how the world actually, the natural world
Hmm.
works.
That's great.
Because again, I don't think you can be a very good economist in the
Hmm.
21st century if you don't know how the world is changing.
Hmm. That's true. That's true. That- And how do you see in other countries, Andrew? Like, if we are not talking about USA, what's your perception? How the whole world is taking this global change and how they have imparted that into the education system? How do you
That's a good
see?
question. Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't have a very encyclopedic answer.
Hmm.
I do know that just because of work that I do with colleagues
Hmm.
around the world, I see that in many parts of the world, and not just Western Europe and the US and Canada and
Hmm. Hmm.
Australia or Japan,
Hmm.
uh, people are taking this very seriously, and students are
Hmm.
interested in learning. So I have a good friend who's a biologist in Brazil,
Hmm.
and particularly with their government, the students are very interested in trying to understand how to make the world better.
Hmm.
I have a friend who teaches earth science in South Africa, where
Hmm.
the whole educational system has changed to be more inclusive,
Hmm.
but students are again very interested in learning about the world. And also I have many friends in China, and
Hmm.
it's politically expedient right now in the US to make China the most terrible group of people in the world. But in fact, China is devoting tremendous resources
Hmm.
to renewable energy. Again, I much of what our Chinese friends are doing is really admirable, at least in terms of uh, educating and actually designing a
Hmm.
world for the future. So I guess the bottom line is that we don't live in a perfect world, but I think in many parts of the
Hmm.
world, you know, nature has forced us to take
Hmm.
global change seriously.
Hmm.
And so it's a subject of tremendous interest to students
Hmm.
and uh, an increasing research focus of countries.
Hmm. And this is what we're talking about the education perspective. How about the media? What role the media is playing in giving awareness to the general public? I mean, if they are not going to school, to this generation as well, it's not only about developing the next generation, their mindset, it's also about us, all of
Yep.
us in one
Yep.
in one box. So how do you see how the media is playing the role, or how the media should play the role?
Again, that's a question that I can probably answer better for the few countries I know well, but I think your underlying point is very important. That we talked in an earlier session about lifelong learning,
Hmm.
and we need to supply the resources so
Hmm.
that people, whether they leave school when they're 10, when they're 18, when they're 25, that they can continue to learn and understand the planet. And then the media has a critical role to
Hmm.
play in that. Um, in the United States, I would give the media mixed grades
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
this.
Hmm.
Certainly, if you look at newspapers like the New York Times, for example,
Hmm.
they do an excellent job,
Hmm.
but the New York Times probably only reaches 10% of the
Hmm.
American public.
Hmm.
Uh, a lot of Americans watch something called Fox News,
Hmm.
which has politicized everything about
Hmm.
science and nature, and arguably does more harm than good.
Hmm.
And we do have both what in the US is called public television, that is non-commercial television, which does a superb job
Hmm.
of educating the public, and some other kinds of stations do a good job. So I think that resources are generated
Hmm.
by responsible newspapers, magazines, television
Hmm.
outlets, some films, and fortunately, many of those resources uh, can spread across the oceans and be
Hmm.
used by people
Hmm.
anywhere. So
Hmm.
hopefully, you can tell me what kind of job the media is doing in Pakistan now, but I think the
Hmm.
potential for the media to play a strong positive role is certainly
Hmm.
there.
Yes, it is. It is. We have seen so many campaigns by the media that they're running and giving awareness to the people that this is what we should do, that what we should not be doing. For example, saving water, even about saving electricity. So we usually get these of the messages from the media, but not specifically mentioning about the global change. They are doing few chunks of those, but not the major term. But they are trying to play their role the way they can, the way you were saying. It's impartial. We can't say it's 100%, and we can't say they are not doing it, but they're doing it. But and I also believe that government also plays a very important role on the media, and letting media giving awareness to the general public. Now, I want to get back to you because you are going to answer my question. I'm not going to answer yours. So you tell me what is the role of the government, which can lead us towards the awareness of this global change.
Yeah, well, absolutely, you're right that the government has an important role to play, because no matter what country you're in, the
Hmm.
government has more resources
Yes.
than most other entities.
True.
It's also clear that, at least in principle, the government is not driven by profit, which is
Hmm.
the case for many types of industries that could color their interest in educating people about the environment. Um, and again, certainly in North America and Western Europe, the government has played an important role in funding research.
Hmm.
So, one of the reasons we know a lot about global change and have good data and models that help us to predict with increasing accuracy how
Hmm.
the world will change, that actually comes from government sponsored
Hmm.
research.
True.
Uh, the government, certainly in North America and Western Europe, is a major funder of education.
Hmm.
So that plays an important role as well. Um, Again, in the United States, sometimes these issues are politicized. That is, they're twisted for
Hmm.
a particular party to get more votes, if you will. But I think by and large, the government has been doing a responsible job in these countries of um, helping us to. They're probably doing their best job helping us to understand
Hmm.
what's happening.
Hmm.
In places like the United States, individual freedom is taken very seriously by the
Hmm.
population.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of people in my country who don't like the government telling them what to think. So one has to be careful there. But nonetheless, I think that, and I don't often say this, but I think in this issue, the government has done more good than harm.
Hmm. Yeah, that's true. And even our prime minister, he's really supporting the plantation, and he's doing it himself. And I mean, this was the great initiative he took, even like when he took in charge. And even now, I heard about that. Like after 2 to 3 months, they have a plan to do the biggest plantation on this earth. I mean, I think about that. I guess I've heard about that, but might be that's not true. Or but they have a big plan about plantation. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's true. Government has done no harm for this thing, and they are trying to educate people, giving awareness to the people. But then it also comes toward the interest of the people as well. But yeah, well, Andrew, as always, I learned a lot about the global change from you, and every viewer, every listener, whosoever is listening and watching this video, they're definitely going to get benefit from you, and they are going to take this global change seriously, just as me. Just because before this interview, I was just not aware that I also have to play my part in this regard. But now I'm definitely going to work on that and will be playing my role, inshallah. Well, thank you so very much for your time once again. It's always so good to see you on screen and listening your views and listening to your ideas. It's always so good, so nice, and it's a tremendous experience that I get, mashallah. So thanks once again, and hope to see you again, inshallah.